Good morning. I said good morning. Thank you. My name is Jasmine Witherspoon, and I'm an MFA candidate of English at the University of Kentucky. Thank you, thank you. On behalf of the university, welcome to the main stage. It's my pleasure to introduce the Secretary of Kentucky Tourism, Arts, and Heritage Cabinet, Mike Berry, who will get us started.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. The first thing I've got to do is a little bit of housekeeping. I've had several people to come to me and say, oh, you must be related to the famous author Wendell Berry. We do have the same last name. And Mr. Berry, I have done my best for years to try to figure out how you and I are related. The best I can come up with is one of your pigs ran across our backyard. And in Kentucky, that makes us kin. There you go. There you go. Well, today we come together to celebrate the 41st Annual Kentucky Book Festival, a weekend that honors our strong and incredible literary traditions here by celebrating the talents of Kentucky writers and publishers. The Kentucky Humanities Council is celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. So let's give Kentucky Humanities a big round of applause. Thank you, Bill Goodman. You know, Kentucky Humanities supports humanities in all 120 counties. They deliver more than 15,000 programs and reach more than 5 million Kentuckians. So today we celebrate the talents and the stories of the Commonwealth, and starting with two giants of Kentucky's literary community, author Wendell Berry and our current Poet Laureate Crystal Wilkinson. Now, born in Henry County, Wendell Berry is an American novelist, a poet, an essayist, an activist, critic, and a farmer. He's referred to as the prophet of rural America by the New York Times, and he's written over 50 books of poetry, fiction, and essays. He's the recipient of the National Humanities Medal awarded by President Barack Obama and was named the Jefferson Lecturer for 2012. He's a winner of the Richard C. Holbrooke Distinguished Achievement Award and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, currently teaching at the University of Kentucky, Crystal Wilkinson is an award-winning author who has utilized the arts as a platform to highlight the Afro-Latin movement that focuses on the cultural contributions of African-American artists, writers, and musicians. Her works include Perfect Black, a collection of poems, and 3 works of fiction, The Birds of Opulence, Water Street, and my personal favorite, Blackberries, Blackberries. She's the recipient of the 2022 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Poetry and a 2016 Ernest J. Gaines Prize for Literary Excellence. Her upcoming book, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghosts, a culinary memoir, is forthcoming from Clarkson Potter Penguin Random. So it's a pleasure to introduce these two literary powerhouses as they discuss Wendell Berry's new book, The Need to Be Whole, Patriotism and the History of Prejudice. You both hold a very special place in the literary community, and I'm honored to be here to experience this one-of-a-kind conversation. Let's welcome our authors.
Thank you. Yeah. So we've been winking and nodding over here at the literary excellence giant, distinguished, whatever he said. But I hope you all can hear us in the back. Can you? Good. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I didn't get nervous until they said go. So I thought that what we would do, since I know that there are lots of readers and also lots of writers here, we would start out with a couple of sort of softball questions before we dive into this heavy subject. So I wanted to ask Wendell, being from Henry County and being a writer, it's always kind of a strange question since we're both Kentucky writers and you pretty much don't know anything else. But how do you think being a Kentucky writer has affected your career?
Well, before I came home to Kentucky from New York, I read Night Comes to the Cumberlands by Harry Caudle. And that kind of alerted me to a responsibility that I would have that wasn't exactly literary when I came back to Kentucky. This is a state that has been mostly given away to people who've mistreated it. And I think that as a Kentucky writer, that's something that we have to notice. There's a responsibility to realize this state in a way that it can't be realized by its institutions, by its officials, its politicians. We have to have it on our mind in a more particular way and in a more complete way. And I think a lot of writers have been attentive to the realization that the more particular you are in your imagining of your subject or your whereabouts, with me it's been a whereabouts, the more universal it becomes. And so you don't worry about whether what you write applies to every place. You worry about doing justice to your place. And Kentucky is geographically an extremely diverse place. And Bill Goodman asked me if I would write a piece about Bobby Ann Mason. And when I wrote that piece, I began to think about this community of Kentucky writers. And I said, in a way, we're all collaborating on the same piece of work to imagine our state in its diversity. And so, in a way, we need each other, and we must know it, because Kentucky writers seem to get along. I don't hear much envy or jealousy or dislike among them. And I have been to places where writers disliked each other. If you mentioned the writer's name, whoever you were talking to would have to explain how he or she differed from that person in assumption or art or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to thank you publicly in front of all these people. I've thanked you privately, but I still, oh my gosh, I've already cried once this morning. I said I wasn't going to start crying. But I remember vividly the first time I read a story in a public way. I think we were at Northern Kentucky University. And I don't think I even knew that you were there at first. And then I thought, oh my God, I read a short story and Wendell Berry is here. And you came up to me and repeated things that I had read and told me what you appreciated about it. And so I appreciate you. You've always been really generous to me and the other writers in the state with your time, and I appreciate you.
Well, of course, I appreciate being appreciated. But it's that recognition of some kind of mutuality is important. And, you know, if you appreciate me, then all I have to say is, well, I appreciate you back. And what we're defining is an important relationship.
Yes, absolutely.
It's personal and artistic or literary.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about the need to be whole But I wanted you all to know about this other book. He's just cranking them out, as he always has, 50, and then plus. But I don't think it's here today, but this is a new book by Wendell, too, How It Went. It's 13 more stories of the Port William membership. And that'll be out next week, I believe, first week in November. Is that next week?
Well, that's nice of you to mention that. And you embarrassed me by asking me when it was going to be published. I didn't know.
Oh, I know. November 4th, I do believe. Yeah. So that's something else for us to look forward to. So let's just, I guess, dive into this. I think, it's particularly since, this country has needed to have a frank conversation around race for a long time, and it's still sort of ongoing. And race has always been something that you has taken up as one of the subjects that haunts you. And I think it certainly haunts this nation. And I think, but particularly since the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and I just heard of another thing that just happened in Nicholasville, I think our need to talk about race in this country just continues and continues. And you started your conversation with yourself and with the nation in The Hidden Wound that was back in 1968, and followed that up with, you continue to talk about race in The Unsettling of America, too. So I think that this book is a continuation of that. And throughout this book, you reflect on several of your personal relationships, be they communal people that were there in Henry County, but you also mention a lot of writers in this book, including your dear friend Ernest Gaines, who was also a mentor of mine, at least on the page. You say at the beginning that you felt like you referred to this book as something owed to Bell Hooks and Eddie Glaude Jr.
Yeah. Yes. Bell Hooks was a very appreciable Kentuckian. And she came to see me, and we had a conversation about The Hidden Wound long after I wrote The Hidden Wound. I would say now I was only about 34 when I did that, and the subject had stayed on my mind, and my reading and my thoughts had carried me beyond it. And so after Bell Hooks came and we talked, I remember writing her a letter and saying, I don't think I did a very good job. Why don't we try it again? But she didn't respond. I think she didn't want to try it again. But anyway, I think that my own mind had changed, and it had become, my sense of the problem had become more comprehensive and more detailed. And by that time, when I talked to Bell Hooks, I couldn't manage the change. I couldn't talk to her well enough from the thinking that finally went into the book, The Need to Be Whole. And I'm not sure when Eddie Glaude's book came out. The summer of 2015, maybe. But anyway, he wrote me a very nice letter, wondered if I'd give him a blurb. And he'd said he'd read The Hidden Wound. And so I read his book very carefully, cover to cover, and I made notes. And I thought, well, I'll write him a letter. I don't want to write a blurb because I don't do that, but I would like to write him a good letter. And by the time I had a whole list of subjects for a letter, I think 12 items that I wanted to raise with him. And by that time, it was too long, too far past for a polite note, and the letter was beyond me, and so I never did write the letter to him. So here's this big book that I hoped he would consider as a reply.
A 500-page reply.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still surprised with some things in that book.
Well, the book covers a lot of territory, and I think one of the important things, and you all can see my copy. It's like I went to church and went to school, and everything. And so many of these pages are highlighted and underlined. And I thought, well, what in the world are we going to talk about? There's so much to talk about. And so I think we decided to talk about the place in which we have commonality. And so Wendell's going to read. And I think that as I was reading the book, I found myself nodding and agreeing, and sometimes I shook my head no. But I think that's what the conversations are about. One thing I noted in the book, that this idea of that when people come together, that the end result should be clarity and not victory.
Yes. So I'm going to read
Yes.
now? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So while he's getting set up, what we agreed to do is that he's going to read this passage, and then we're going to have a conversation about it. You'll see why we can have a conversation about this particular passage.
This is electronically complicated. All right. This is a part of my book, The Need to Be Whole. A chapter entitled Crystal Wilkinson, The Tragedy of the American Home Place. And I'd had, before this chapter, strung together a series of black writers who had talked about the relationship between them and the land. Predominantly, maybe, the man known as Nate Shaw in a book called All God's Dangers, a great book, I think. And Ernest Gaines, another great book, I think, Gathering of Old Men. The several passages I have gathered here speak for the persistence among black people of the rural South of the traditional agrarianism that I learned from people of both races beginning in my earliest childhood, and that I have sustained in my thoughts ever since, partly with the help of the books I've been quoting. Thinking again about these passages has given me pleasure and a needed comfort. This agrarianism, this high regard for all that is implied by persons and a peoples belonging to their homeland, survived principally by word of mouth from ancient times, appearing only intermittently in the written record. Though it remains important and necessary, as shown by the bad effects of the modern forgetfulness of it, it is scarce in the writing of both races in our time, though it has continued. If it had continued among us with, say, half the force of technological determinism, then many of our newsworthy problems, including climate change, would now be significantly smaller and slower, and some would have been prevented. But all that it has survived and continued at all is a wonder deserving our thanks. And so I'm grateful and also happy that the last of the passages I want to think about here is from a novel published in 2016, The Birds of Opulence, by my fellow Kentuckian Crystal Wilkinson. This novel deals mainly with a household consisting of a lineage of women headed by the widowed great-grandmother, Minnie May Good. There's also a faithful, useful man, Joe Brown, Minnie Mae's grandson-in-law, and his son, Kiki. The Goods, who are farm people, have moved into a nearby small town in rural Kentucky. The central event of this book is an epic church picnic, Dinner on the Grounds. This is a gathering of the local black people, and by now, the time of the gatherings, 1976, their far scattered kin that goes back, Minnie Mae declares, to slave times. Dinner on the Grounds draws home the community's wayward children, even those who live as far off as Texas or California. And so begins a heart-aching comedy of misfitting relatives, which Crystal Wilkinson understands as one more chapter in the misfitting of country people and city people, a comedy always revealing itself as tragic and destructive. The returnees, quote, show up talking city talk and driving long, shiny black Cadillacs and red sports cars. They bring exotic gifts for their relatives, silver trays for chitlings and fried potatoes, and crystal goblets for Kool-Aid and sweet iced tea. The mothers and grandmothers say, thank you, baby, and we'll wait for the out-of-towners to leave before placing the items in the attic with the other strange things their kin have brought home. On the day before Dinner on the Grounds, Minnie Mae's sons arrive in a shiny white Oldsmobile. They are awkwardly conscious of their difference now from their country relatives. Their greetings are too hearty. They laugh too much, Crystal says. They, quote, look uncomfortable and out of place in their clothes. There is some congeniality, some telling of funny stories from when they were young and living at home. But Minnie Mae having gone to bed, the brothers get to the business they have on their minds. Their mother is getting old. The time is coming when she may need expensive care. We'll be a whole lot better off if we start making some plans, they say. And so they have turned their minds to the one family property of any value that can be sold, the small ancestral farm that lies not far from town. We was thinking that we ought to sell the home place, they say. This completes the revelation of the brothers' estrangement from the rest of the family. A coldness falls upon them, and they part for the night, mostly in silence. It remains for the two brothers to present their concerns to their mother, Minnie Mae, herself, who, while she lasts, will have the final say. In the time that they have lived in cities, she has always expected her sons to return twice a year and go with her to their home place. In the spring to plant the early garden, in the fall to set the place to rights before winter. Though she and her family have lived in the nearby town, they have continued to cherish the home place and to take a part of their living from it. Minnie Mae has imposed these seasonal duties on her sons as a way of keeping them mindful of their home place and responsible to it, or as a way of trying to do so. And so here we arrive at the very heart, both of Crystal Wilkinson's book and, I think, of our country's history, the progressive homelessness of all its races. In late August 1976, the three of them have again come to the home place on their autumnal visit. And then occurs a scene realized in the particularity of the time and place, which yet the author requires us to perceive as ancient. Some might see it as a biblical archetype, but surely it is older than the Bible, older than farming. It has happened countless times in countless generations. The aging parent, near to death and full of knowledge, offers the land to its inheritors to the land. Here is the quote from the book. "This is you all's what for?" Minnie May says, placing one hand on her hip and the other one spreading far and wide from one edge of the knob across the creek to the other side. The moon is out and the farm is glowing behind her. "All this," she says, "been up under your people's feet since slave times. My mama and daddy worked this land, and their mama and daddy before them. All y'all was raised up on money the tobacco brought in and the garden food we put on the table. Over that ridge there is a graveyard, a whole village of our folks over there. You boys played over there in them fields when you was little." It's the end of that passage. But the older son replies, and the younger agrees. I'm quoting again. "Mama, I don't see why you don't sell this old place. None of us set to be farmers. We all got our own lives, good lives. It's just sitting here growing weeds. You know you're getting too old to keep putting in the garden. And look at the house. Ain't nothing much left but firewood." End of the quote. This, may God help us, is the voice of sound economic sense, of realism, of reason in our time. In her reply, Minnie May speaks pretty faithfully for many of the elderly farm people I've known. Her rage is old, coming from way back, and so is her heartbreak. This is the quote. "Hush your bad mouth. Can't even see yourself when you're feasting your eyes right in the looking glass. Hush your ignorant mouth. This ain't about no grade of wood on no house. Not one but two full-grown fools. You are ashamed before God, your daddy, and all your people." End of the quote. Crystal Wilkinson's summation of the tragedy of Minnie May, which I will quote to conclude my consideration of this book, is more modern than ancient, but by now it is one of millions. Many of us no doubt believe that the dominant story of modern America is that of success, of the transfigured executive or politician who has levitated from a little farm at the end of nowhere to wealth and power. But the tragedy of Minnie May has been suffered on such little farms millions of times all over the industrial world. Quote, "But when it comes to her sons, once the initial hugs are made, the general how are yous delivered, once dinner has been served and eaten, then foreigners step into the bodies of Minnie May's babies."
Thank you. Thank you for that. He told me a few years ago, and he said, I'm writing a book about race. And I went, okay. And he said, I'm opening it up with Ernest Gaines, and I'm going to close it with you. And I said, okay. And here it is, 500 pages later. I mean, I think that this idea of commonality and allegiance to the land in the beginning is where we stand on common ground. and that's what I have certainly seen and learned from in all your work, in both your nonfiction and your fiction. I remember carrying the memory of old Jack around like it was my Bible. I mean, literally, like to my breast for a long time, because everything that happens to old Jack reminded me of my grandfather and how the old-time people that I grew up with lived in their world. So thank you for that. And I wanted to ask you, when you were reading that passage and you talked about Minnie May, I have a particular fondness for her too, and what she stands for. But why was that a passage that related to you in this? You explain it some in the book, but
Well, Minnie May as a character, I imagine, comes from knowledge, from acquaintance with old ladies. It speaks to my acquaintance with old ladies. But as she appears here, she's imagined, and she assumes in your imagination a stature and a magnitude that's extraordinary. This is a very powerful figure, and she speaks very powerfully. She's eloquent far beyond what people now would expect of a country woman who probably wasn't well educated. So there comes a time when she begins to speak in my imagination, not as a specifically black person, but as a specifically country person, and a kind of archetypal, disappointed old woman whose family is scattering about. And this is something extremely important to me. I got to know, Ernest J. Gaines and I became friends in 1958 in a conversation in a backyard in Menlo Park, California. And he became important to me then. And as these books came out, I read them. And I wasn't prepared for this, but there would come times when I would be reading along and I'd say, he's speaking for me. He's talking for me. And when I read your work, I read the book, the poetry book,
Perfect Black.
Perfect Blackness. And I'd be reading along, and all of a sudden be like two naked electric wires were touched, and the sparks were going everywhere. Yes, I know what she's talking about. I know it from my own experience and acquaintance. And I think that it's extremely important to see those things when they happen. Yes, this is where my experience crosses yours. We are by the common talk now, the public talk. You and I are probably as opposite as people can get. And we're not supposed to have things in common, but we do. And I think this is true with Ernest Gaines, with Bell Hooks. I read those people, and I realize that instead of the stereotypical racial division that we have a lot of public rhetoric about, and very bitter rhetoric, there's this other thing cutting across it, which is, well, the mutuality of country people.
Yes.
The agrarianism of black writers seems to me finally to be exactly the same as the agrarianism of white writers. And that's where we ought to start thinking.
Yeah.
And we get from there into what we've lost by our cultural and geographic placement that we're getting farther from us all the time. So the conversation then becomes, Crystal Wilkinson and I can talk like two writers, like two people, interested in some of the same things, with a heritage in common. And this racial bifurcation has nothing to do with it. But when the conversation becomes abstract, then's when the irreconcilable difference begins to appear. And it's just too bad. I made the sort of the model of relationship, or that I was putting into my book, the idea of a good faith conversation between two people who earnestly wanted to speak to each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we have to bring it back to. That I don't think the government can make the reconciliation. There can't be a public institutional reconciliation. It'll come about from people talking to each other, liking each other, helping each other, finally working together if there are places where people really actually work together anymore.
Right. I think, one of the things you say in the book, you talk about love, and you talk about a sense of neighbors. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And in the specific sense, of course, but also in the national sense of how this idea of trying to divide what's right. Like I said, what was the quote? Clarity and not victory.
Yes.
How do we get there?
By speaking very carefully. This is another service that expected of us writers, and that is to keep the language particular and careful enough so that it can actually be talked in. To stick with the public rhetoric is just to lose the whole game, it seems to me.
Right.
When we talk in particular very carefully about what we know, then maybe we'll get to know each other and good will come of it. I said somewhere in that book that I think the verb to know is one of the most troubling. And I felt this very strongly. Who am I to speak in public and say that I knew certain black people? Well, as my dad said when he got old, who else was there who's still living? Now, maybe I'm not going to be confronted on this, but it's an important question. Who am I to say that I knew these people? And then I said, maybe the knowledge of a child is the most trustworthy knowledge, and you had to be ready to depend on it.
Well, I think that we're getting to the end of our time and wrap up. And I know you've written several books, and in this particular book, 500 pages on the subject. Why does race, slavery, what happened post-slavery, and the different ways in which the thread of that sort of prejudice continues to rule people, why is that something that continues to haunt you as a writer?
Well, those of us who were born into it have an obligation to understand it, for one thing, to understand how it worked as a generality and how it worked in particular, how it was shed at certain points. So there's that. But I wrote The Hidden Wound with the idea that race prejudice, racism, had hurt white people as much as it had black people. Hard to prove, but to my surprise, this new book enlarges the indictment by saying, and it quotes a conversation between John Quincy Adams and John C. Calhoun in 1820. John Quincy Adams had got straight on this business of race prejudice. It's wrong. Slavery is wrong. You can't defend it. You can't defend it under our founding documents. You can't defend it out of the gospel. John C. Calhoun told him that he thought that his conviction and his argument was admirable. But down home, he said it's different. And he made the distinction between work that is degrading and the people who were supposed to do that, you know who, the slaves. The work that is not degrading is for white people. And my argument in the book is that the culture, the society has gone the way of John C. Calhoun. That nearly everybody now doesn't want to do degrading work, that is bodily work, that involves sweat and dirt and those things. So we've become a society that can't roll up its own car windows. I said I thought the American dream was headed to become early interment with a smartphone. But that needs to be reckoned with. But I see that coming straight from the experience of slavery.
Yeah, and in the book, when you all read it, he makes this wonderful argument of reaching from slavery all the way through to extraction of everything, particularly in Appalachia and the rural areas, to what is deemed as work culture or the labor force now.
Yes. The extraction of everything, including the lives of working people.
Yes.
We think that we've greatly improved work by introducing a lot of machinery and automation and that sort of thing. But there are people in this country now who are doing awful work. Work that is overseen by computers. They're penalized if they don't hit so many keystrokes in such a length of time. This is a kind of slavery, and it's been rightly called wage slavery.
Well, I think we could probably talk about this all day. I want to thank you all so much for being with us this morning. Make sure you buy the book. And I wanted to, here you are beside me, but I'm going to quote you as we close. Like Bell, Wendell says that love will lead the way. In their chapter in the book titled Prejudice, Victory, and Freedom, he says, "It is love that leads us toward particular knowledge, and it helps us to learn where we need to go." And I think that's a big umbrella thing in the book, too. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Wendell.
Thank you. That's a good job.